Hey, this is Mr. Peterson. This screencast is about cells, and in particular, about different types of cells. Well, first of all, let's talk about before we get to different types of cells, let's just talk about the characteristics that all cells have in common. So they tend to be microscopic. So here's a ruler, and on this side of the ruler, there are centimeters, and there are also millimeters. Most cells are smaller than a millimeter. We tend to measure them in things called micrometers. And so for every millimeter, there's 1,000 micrometers. So we get down to the level of micrometers, and that's the level of cells. And I'll give you some examples here shortly. All cells are enclosed in a membrane. We've talked about membranes, phospholipids, proteins. So membranes are ubiquitous. They're the same pretty much throughout all of the kingdoms of life. And they're filled with cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is a complex network of molecules and mostly water, but that's the inside of cells. So cells have membranes and they have cytoplasm. So here's a bacteria that's been magnified thousands of times, but they're very, very small, but they still have a membrane and they still have cytoplasm. So here we can look at the scales of things. You can see a red blood cell. That's about, it says 10,000 nanometers. That's 10 microns, 10 micrometers. So, in other words, you could take 100 in a millimeter. You could take 100 of those, and you would get a millimeter. But then you see that little rod-shaped thing. That's an E. coli, and I know you've heard of that with regards to food poisoning. So E. coli is a bacteria. It's not a red blood cell, but it's much, much smaller. So you can see that that's on the scale of maybe 1 or 2 micrometers in size. So not very big. And then get even smaller and you can see some viruses. Viruses aren't cells, but you kind of get the idea. So smallpox, none of you have ever seen smallpox, but we've talked about, or you've heard of people who have Ebola. Ebola is a virus. But it's not a cell, and it's very, very small. So some big ideas here. Let's start with viruses, because viruses are not cells. Viruses are not cells. They don't have cell membranes, they don't have cytoplasm, and they don't have any cell parts, things called organelles. Viruses are obligate parasites. In other words, they have to have a host. They have DNA or RNA, so the nucleic acids. They don't grow or develop by themselves. So the viruses that are on the tabletop sitting in front of you, oh, gross! They don't grow or develop. And they can't obtain energy except for a host. They need a host. They don't respond to environments, but they do change over time. So viruses mutate a lot. So here are some different viruses. You can see the influenza virus. You've probably heard of that a lot. There are different shapes and sizes. Adenoviruses can cause colds. Tobacco mosaic viruses infect tobacco plants, so there are plant viruses. Then you can also see the thing called bacteriophage. It looks like a lunar lander, like a spaceship. So there are viruses that impact bacteria. And that bacteriophage, that means bacteria eater, that's what they look like. Well, if we talk about the kind of cells that you and I are made of, there are two basic kinds of cells. There are eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic means true nucleated. Prokaryotic means pre-nucleated. So you and I are made of eukaryotic cells. Anything with a nucleus is eukaryotic. Anything without is prokaryotic. So let's talk about that. Here's a typical eukaryotic cell. It has a membrane. It has cytoplasm. So things like all cells have. But it also has some smaller structures inside called organelles. The organelle that happens to be labeled there is mitochondria. So you can see there are a variety of mitochondria in there. But it also has a nucleus where the DNA is located in chromosomes. So they have a nucleus, they have membrane bound, which means like they're surrounded by membranes, those organelles. Prokaryotic cells, not so much. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. They don't have any membrane-surrounded organelles. So differences between those two, eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. There are some similarities, though. So we all have some common ancestry. If you look at this, the differences between the variety of eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, bacteria. So here's all living things. Archaea, those are really old organisms that hang out in sulfur springs, places like Yellowstone or deep ocean vents. Bacteria, which are all over the place. You and I have about a quarter cup of bacteria in our small intestine. That's okay, we want those guys there. And then eukaryotes, that's us. Plants, animals, fungi, all the other living things that aren't bacteria or archaea. Okay, so what I'd like you to do right now in your notes is I'd like you to make a Venn diagram. Make a Venn diagram that compares the prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So what are similarities? What are differences? So classic Venn diagram activity. Do that in your notes. We'll share that in class. All right? Thanks. Hope that helps.